Hey everyone, it's Jen from Midnight Sky Fibers, and I'm here today to talk to you about measuring the gauge for your hand-spun yarn. First, what is gauge? Gauge is the number of stitches and rows that you have in every inch or in every 4 inches, depending on the knitting pattern that you're going to follow. Gauge is really important because it determines if your project will look like the pattern you're following. If you have too few stitches or too many stitches, your project's going to end up quite a bit bigger or smaller than what it intended, and even if you want the larger or smaller sizes, it changes the way the fabric drapes and looks in the finished project. So it's important to understand how gauge works so that you can figure out how to change it if you need to. Hand-spun yarns can be pretty tricky to measure for the gauge, especially for hand-spun yarns that are thick and thin, have big sections of really thin spots and really thick spots, yarns that have buttons or bobbles or feathers or ribbon or other things added into them. And it's also important with hand-spun yarns when you're measuring the gauge, because if you're spinning a bunch of different bobbins for your yarn, or if you're buying a large number of hand-spun skeins for a project, you want to know if the gauge for your project is going to differ a little bit, since just as you're spinning along or someone's spinning along, the gauge tends to differ from bobbin to bobbin a tiny bit, and so you want to know that so you know how before you start the project, so that you don't end up with a big section that has a stripe of a very different gauge of yarn in the middle of your sweater. Tools to measure gauge. The quickest way to measure gauge is just using a tape measure to measure how many stitches and how many rows you have in every inch. A ruler is generally pretty easy. Most people already have them in their collection, but a tool that's actually called a knitting gauge is really handy and is going to be a little bit easier and faster to use usually. A knitting gauge looks a lot like a short little ruler. It's usually anywhere between 2 and 6 inches long, and they tend to also have needle sizes, usually from 0 to 15, punched into the bottom or sides of your knitting gauge, so you can easily see what size of knitting needles you're using, which is especially handy because the size is printed on the sides of knitting needles tend to rub off. This is an example of a knitting gauge. You can get these for a couple of dollars in almost any knitting or craft store. This is a really old one. As you can see, the paint's wearing off on the edges. However, it still works great. It's a little bit bent and has been bent back into shape, but that's just fine. This is my favorite style of knitting gauge because it has multiple inches across. It's not just 2 or 3 inches across, and the measuring part's across the top, not just the little 2-inch stitch measure which you see in the middle of the gauge. I don't like those since I find it more difficult to count the stitches when I can't actually see full V's or full purl bumps or whatever else when I'm counting the gauge. Some more about gauges. There's also really cool plastic ones that are clear. They're about the same as the cost of the metal gauges, and they're really nice because it makes it easy, even with the small ones that are just 2 inches across, to be able to count how many stitches, and you can see the stitches really clearly where you're counting. They also make fancier gauges, often in the shape of animals, sheep, alpaca, and or rabbits. I don't like those ones as well. I think they're ridiculously cute, but the gauge is usually one of the little 2-inch sections punched out of the middle of it somewhere, and I don't like counting with those as easily. I think the other ones don't take up that much more space, which is the same for the very small ones. I like the 4 or 6-inch measurement tools much better than the 2-inch ones, since I think it's better to measure over multiple inches instead of just 1 or 2 inches, because you're going to get a more accurate gauge reading. So, next, how to count stitches for the stitches per inch for your gauge. So what you're going to do is you're going to use a ruler and you're going to measure across at least 2 inches of your swatch, and you're going to divide by the number of inches. You're going to want to make sure that you measure in several places to make sure that you have the correct measurement. So for example, if you have 5 stitches over a 2-inch section of your project, which is approximately what this one probably has, you're going to have 2.5 stitches per inch. And then if you're going to measure for the row gauge, you are going to measure the number of rows in at least a 2-inch section, and then you're going to divide it by the number of inches again. This is going to be especially nice in stitch. As you can see in this nice little swatch, you can just count up how many V's there are in a row. Sometimes it's easier to count if you use a pin or the edge of a knitting needle to count up the stitches, so that you can be sure that you're not accidentally changing rows or changing stitches, that you're counting the full V's either when you're measuring the rows or the stitches per inch. So here's a sample for calculating your stitches and row gauges. The next page will have one that you can use for calculating it yourself. This is just a little Excel document they calculated out automatically for me. So this would be the number of inches that you're measuring. So in this case, I'm measuring 2 inches, and I have 4 stitches into the inch. And then I'm dividing it by the number of inches. So I'd have 2 stitches per every inch. And then, since many gauge swatches are 4x4 squares, I just multiplied the number of stitches per inch by 4, since for many projects, especially larger projects like sweater, they give it in stitches per 4x4 instead of per inch. So this is just the sample for if you want to do your own. So you can just see what it looks like without the numbers.